The gold band caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the dusty window of McGregor's general store, and Jonas Hartley couldn't tear his eyes away from the desperate woman trying to sell it. She stood at the counter with her back rigid, shoulders thrown back in a pride that seemed to be the only thing holding her together. And Jonas watched as her trembling fingers pushed the ring toward old Albert McGregor. The storekeeper squinted at it through his spectacles, turning it over with the critical eye of a man who had seen too many desperate souls come through his doors in Redemption, Texas, during these hard times of 1878. Jonas had only stopped in to pick up supplies before heading back to the ranch where he worked, but something about the woman's quiet desperation made him pause near the shelf of canned goods, pretending to examine labels he had memorized years ago. "It is real gold," the woman said, and her voice carried the faintest tremor beneath its determination. "My husband bought it in San Antonio 3 years ago. I need medicine, Mr. McGregor. My daughter has been burning with fever for 2 days, and Dr. Winters said she needs quinine or she might not make it through another night." Jonas felt his chest tighten at the raw fear threading through her words. He shifted slightly to get a better look at her face and felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with sympathy. She was beautiful in the way a storm was beautiful, all fierce energy barely contained, with dark hair pulled back in a bun that was coming loose, wisps framing a face pale with worry and exhaustion. Her dress was clean but worn, mended in several places with careful stitches that spoke of pride and poverty existing side by side. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old, and the shadows under her green eyes suggested she hadn't slept in days. "Where is your husband?" McGregor asked, his tone not unkind but practical. "Seems like he should be handling this matter." The woman's jaw tightened, and Jonas saw her swallow hard before answering. "He died 4 months ago. Cattle drive went wrong up near Abilene. A stampede." Her voice went flat on that last word, as if she had told the story so many times that it had lost all meaning except as an explanation for why her life had fallen apart. "The ring is all I have left of value, and I need that medicine today. Please, Mr. McGregor." The storekeeper sighed and picked up the ring again, holding it to the light. "It is decent gold, I will give you that. But I cannot give you full value for it, Mrs. Dalton, Sarah Dalton." She lifted her chin higher. "I am not asking for full value. I am asking for enough to buy the medicine my daughter needs to live." Jonas made his decision in that moment, the way he made most decisions, quickly and from the gut. He had been working as a ranch hand for the better part of 10 years, since he was 18 years old, and he had saved most of his wages because there was never anything he wanted badly enough to spend them on. He lived simply, worked hard, and kept to himself mostly, drifting from ranch to ranch as the work demanded. But something about Sarah Dalton and her desperate courage called to something deep in his chest that he had thought died back when his own family was killed by raiders when he was just a boy. He stepped forward, his boots loud on the wooden floor, and both Sarah and McGregor turned to look at him. Sarah's eyes widened slightly as she took in his tall frame, the worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, the hat he held respectfully in his hands, and the honest, weathered face of a man who spent his days under the Texas sun. Jonas was not a handsome man in the classical sense, but there was something solid and trustworthy about him, something in his steady gray eyes that made people instinctively feel safe. "Pardon me for interrupting," Jonas said, his voice low and respectful, "but I would like to buy that ring, if the lady is willing to sell it." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion, and McGregor looked equally puzzled. Jonas reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch, counting out bills and coins onto the counter with deliberate care. It was far more than the ring was worth, enough to buy the medicine and then some, and he saw Sarah's eyes go wide with shock. "I cannot accept that much," she said immediately, shaking her head. "That is far too generous, sir. I only need enough for the quinine." Jonas met her eyes steadily, and he saw the pride warring with desperation in her face. He understood that war, had fought it himself in the early days after losing his family when well-meaning neighbors had tried to help, and he had been too proud to accept it. But he also understood that sometimes pride was a luxury nobody could afford. "The ring is worth it," he said simply. "And if there is anything left over after the medicine, you can use it to buy food for your daughter when she recovers. Growing girls need good food." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and Jonas could see her trying to puzzle out his motives, trying to determine if there was some catch or expectation hidden in his offer. He kept his expression open and honest, letting her see that he wanted nothing from her except the knowledge that he had helped someone who needed it. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not even know me." Jonas shrugged slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but determined to see this through. "I know you are a mother trying to save her child. That is enough." McGregor cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Well, if you are buying the ring, Mr. Hartley, I suppose that is your business. Mrs. Dalton, I can sell you the quinine right now." Sarah looked between the two men, and Jonas saw the moment when her desperation won out over her pride. She nodded shakily, and he pushed the money across the counter to McGregor, who counted it out and then went to fetch the medicine from the locked cabinet behind the counter where he kept the valuable medications. Jonas picked up the ring, feeling the weight of it in his palm, warm from where it had rested against Sarah's skin. He could see the inscription inside, worn but still legible. "To Sarah, forever, James." His throat tightened as he read those words and thought about the man who had bought this ring with hope and love, never knowing that forever would be measured in such short years. McGregor returned with a small brown bottle and handed it to Sarah along with the change from Jonas's payment. She clutched the bottle like it was the most precious thing in the world, and Jonas supposed that in that moment it was. "Thank you," she said, looking at Jonas with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "I do not know how to repay such kindness." Jonas shook his head. "No repayment needed, ma'am. I hope your daughter recovers quickly." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, but Jonas found himself speaking before he could think better of it. "Mrs. Dalton, where do you live, in case you need any help with anything?" She paused at the door and looked back at him, and he saw wariness flicker across her face. "Past the church. The one with the blue past the church. The one with the blue shutters, though they are fairly faded now." "I will remember," Jonas said simply. And then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her with a jingle of the bell. McGregor gave him a long, measuring look as Jonas gathered up his own supplies. "That was a generous thing you did, Hartley. But I feel obliged to warn you that there are some in town who might get the wrong idea about a single man taking such an interest in a widow woman." Jonas felt his jaw tighten. "I am not taking an interest. I am just helping someone who needed it." The storekeeper held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I believe you, son, but not everyone thinks as charitably as we might hope. Just be careful, is all I'm saying. The widow Dalton has had enough trouble without adding scandal to her burdens." Jonas nodded, understanding the warning, even if he did not particularly like it. Small towns like Redemption thrived on gossip, and a widow was always vulnerable to wagging tongues. He paid for his supplies and headed out into the afternoon heat, intending to return to the Rockingham Ranch where he had been working for the past 6 months. But his hand kept returning to his pocket where the ring rested, and his mind kept returning to the image of Sarah Dalton's desperate courage. He had meant what he said about not wanting anything from her, but he could not deny the strange pull he felt, the sense that their paths had crossed for a reason beyond simple coincidence. Jonas had never been a man who believed much in fate or divine providence, not after losing his family so young and so violently. But something about today felt different, felt important in a way he could not quite name. The ride back to the ranch took about 40 minutes, and Jonas spent most of it turning the ring over in his fingers, feeling the warmth of the gold and thinking about the woman who had worn it. He arrived at the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a day that had been full of such desperate sorrow. The Rocking M was a good-sized spread, running about 2,000 head of cattle across land that stretched as far as the eye could see in some directions. Jonas worked primarily with the horses, breaking and training the wild mustangs that the ranch hands brought in from the open range. His boss, Martin Calloway, was a fair man in his 50s who ran the ranch with his 2 sons, and he had always treated Jonas well. Jonas lived in the bunkhouse with about a dozen other ranch hands, men who came and went with the seasons and the work, drifting like tumbleweeds across Texas and beyond. Most of them were good men, hard-working and honest, but they were also rootless, unconnected to anything or anyone beyond their next paycheck. Jonas had been like that for years, content to drift from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or form attachments that could be ripped away. But lately, as he approached his 30th year, He had started to feel a restlessness that had nothing to do with wanderlust and everything to do with loneliness. He watched Martin with his wife and sons, saw the way they worked together as a unit, and felt something missing in his own life that he could not quite name. He pushed those thoughts aside as he unsaddled his horse and settled into the familiar routine of evening chores. But that night, lying in his bunk and listening to the snores and rustles of the other men, Jonas could not stop thinking about Sarah Dalton. He wondered if the medicine had worked, if her daughter was already starting to improve, or if Sarah was sitting vigil by a sickbed, watching and praying through another long night. He pulled the ring from under his pillow, where he had tucked it, and turned it over in the moonlight streaming through the window. The gold gleamed softly, and he could still see the inscription inside, that promise of forever that had been broken too soon. Jonas had no idea why he had bought the ring, beyond the immediate desire to help Sarah keep something that clearly meant so much to her. He supposed he could just give it back to her, but something held him back from that simple solution. Instead, he found himself thinking about how her eyes had looked when she had thanked him, the way her voice had trembled with emotion she was trying so hard to contain, and the proud set of her shoulders even in the midst of her desperation. Sarah Dalton was a fighter. He could see that clearly, and he admired that quality in her, even as it made his chest ache to think about all she had lost and all she was struggling against. Sleep was a long time coming that night, and when it finally arrived, Jonas's dreams were filled with green eyes and desperate courage. The next day was Sunday, and Jonas had the morning off like most of the ranch hands. He cleaned up as best he could, shaving carefully and putting on his least worn shirt, and then he saddled his horse and rode back into Redemption. He told himself he was just checking to see if Sarah needed anything, just making sure the medicine had worked, but part of him knew he was lying to himself. The truth was that he wanted to see her again, wanted to see if the strange pull he had felt yesterday was real or just his imagination working overtime. The church bells were ringing as he rode into town, calling the faithful to morning services, and Jonas felt a stab of awkwardness as he realized he might be intruding on Sarah's Sunday routine. But he had come this far, and turning back now felt cowardly, so he continued on toward the eastern edge of town, past the white-painted church where he could hear the congregation singing hymns. The house with the blue shutters was easy to find, just as Sarah had described, though the shutters were indeed badly faded, and the whole place had the slightly shabby look of a property that was being maintained on determination alone. The small yard was neat, though, with a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending, and there were cheerful yellow curtains in the windows that spoke of someone trying to make a home despite difficult circumstances. Jonas dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post, then walked up to the front door with his heart beating unaccountably hard in his chest. He knocked softly, not wanting to wake anyone if they were resting, and waited. After a moment he heard light footsteps, and then the door opened to reveal Sarah Dalton, looking surprised and wary in equal measure. She was wearing a simple gray dress with a white apron over it, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. The shadows under her eyes were still there, but they seemed lighter somehow, and when she saw who was standing on her porch, her expression shifted from wariness to confusion to something that might have been cautious pleasure. "Mr. Hartley," she said, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice. "I did not expect to see you again." Jonas removed his hat, suddenly feeling foolish for coming, but determined not to show it. "I hope I'm not intruding, ma'am. I just wanted to check and see if your daughter is doing better." Sarah's face transformed with a smile that made Jonas forget to breathe for a moment. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, lighting up her whole face and making her eyes sparkle with joy and relief. "She is much better," Sarah said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "The fever broke during the night, and she woke up this morning asking for breakfast. I cannot tell you what a relief it is, what a blessing." "I am very glad to hear it," Jonas said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "That is wonderful news." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her wrestling with something before she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in? I just made coffee, and it seems wrong not to offer you something after what you did for us yesterday." Jonas hesitated, remembering McGregor's warning about small-town gossip, but Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "I know what people might say, but I do not care," she said firmly. "You saved my daughter's life, and the least I can do is offer you a cup of coffee. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." That made Jonas smile, and he stepped inside, ducking slightly to clear the low door frame. The interior of the house was small but immaculately clean, with simple furniture that showed signs of age but also careful maintenance. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table, and a child's drawings pinned to the wall, and the whole place had the feeling of a home that was loved despite its poverty. Sarah led him to the kitchen and poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, then gestured for him to sit at the small table. Jonas felt too large for the delicate chair, but he settled into it carefully, setting his hat on his knee. Sarah sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her mug as if seeking its warmth despite the already mounting heat of the day. "I want to properly thank you for what you did," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I was desperate yesterday, and you helped me without asking for anything in return. That kind of kindness is rare, Mr. Hartley, and I will not forget it." Jonas shook his head. "Please, call me Jonas, and I'm just glad I was there at the right time to help." Sarah smiled slightly. "Jonas, then, and you must call me Sarah." She paused, studying him over the rim of her mug. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you buy the ring? You gave me far more than it was worth, more than I needed. Why?" Jonas considered his answer carefully, wanting to be honest without revealing feelings he barely understood himself. "I suppose I saw something in you that reminded me of people I used to know, strength and courage in the face of hard times. I wanted to help, and I had the means to do so. It seemed like a simple equation." "Nothing about yesterday was simple," Sarah said softly. "I was selling my wedding ring, the last piece of my husband I had left. I felt like I was betraying his memory, but I would have done anything to save Emma, anything at all." "Emma is your daughter?" Sarah nodded. "She is 5 years old, and she is my whole world. When her father died, I thought my life was over. But then I realized I had to keep going for her, had to find a way to survive and make a life for us. It has not been easy." Jonas could hear the understatement in her words, could imagine the struggle of a widow trying to make her way in a world that was not kind to women alone. "What have you been doing to get by?" he asked gently. "Hotel restaurant. I do whatever work I can do. I take in laundry and mending. I bake pies and cakes for the hotel restaurant. I do whatever work I can find that allows me to keep Emma with me. It is not much, but we have been managing until she got sick, and suddenly I needed money I did not have." "What about your husband's family, or your own?" Sarah's expression closed off, and Jonas immediately regretted the question. "James was an only child, and his parents died before we married. My own family disowned me when I chose to marry him against their wishes. They thought he was beneath me, that I was throwing away my future." Her laugh was bitter. "They were right, in a way, though not for the reasons they thought. But I love James, and I would make the same choice again if I could." Jonas felt a surge of admiration for her fierce loyalty, even as his heart ached for her loneliness. Before he could respond, a small voice called out from another room. "Mama?" Sarah's expression immediately transformed to concern, and she rose quickly from the table. "Excuse me," she said to Jonas, then moved toward the doorway. "I am here, sweetheart. Do you need something?" Jonas heard the murmur of voices, and then Sarah returned, leading a small girl by the hand. Emma Dalton was a tiny thing, pale and thin from her illness. But there was color in her cheeks now, and her eyes were bright with curiosity as she looked at the stranger in her kitchen. She had her mother's dark hair and the same green eyes, and Jonas felt his chest tighten at the sight of her. "Emma, this is Mr. Hartley," Sarah said gently. "He is a friend who helped us." Emma studied Jonas with the serious intensity that only children could manage. "You are very tall," she announced finally. Jonas smiled. "I suppose I am. And you are very brave, from what your mother tells me." Emma looked puzzled. "I just had a fever. I was not brave." "Being brave is not just about big things," Jonas said seriously. "It is also about small things, like taking medicine that tastes bad and resting when you want to play." Emma considered this, then nodded as if satisfied with his logic. "I did take medicine that tasted terrible, like old socks smell, I think." Sarah laughed, a real laugh full of relief and joy, and Jonas felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sound. "You have never tasted old socks, Emma Jane, so you cannot make that comparison." "I can imagine," Emma said with the confident authority of childhood, and Jonas found himself grinning. They spent the next hour sitting around the table, Jonas listening as Sarah and Emma talked about small things, everyday things, the rhythm of their life together. Emma slowly began to include Jonas in the conversation, asking him questions about his work with horses, her eyes growing wide when he described breaking wild mustangs. "Are you not scared?" she asked. "Sometimes," Jonas admitted, "but being scared is not always a bad thing. It keeps you careful and respectful of what you are doing." Sarah was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something soft and thoughtful in her eyes that made him hyper-aware of her presence. When Emma started to flag, yawning despite her best efforts to stay awake, Sarah scooped her up and carried her back to bed. Jonas stood when she returned, knowing he had overstayed his welcome, even though he was reluctant to leave. "Thank you for the coffee and the company," he said, retrieving his hat. Sarah walked him to the door, and for a moment, they stood close together in the small entryway, close enough that Jonas could smell the faint scent of lavender soap and see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "It meant a great deal to both of us." Jonas reached into his pocket, feeling the ring there, and made a decision, but instead of pulling it out, he left it where it was. "I am working at the Rockingham Ranch, about 6 miles west of town," he said instead. "If you or Emma need anything, you can get word to me there." Sarah's eyes glistened slightly. "You have already done so much." "I mean it," Jonas said firmly. "Anything at all." She nodded, and Jonas thought he saw something like hope flicker across her face before she schooled her expression back to polite gratitude. He left then, riding back toward the ranch with his mind full of green eyes and a child's curious questions and the feeling that his life had just shifted on its axis in a way he could not yet fully understand. Over the following weeks, Jonas found himself riding into redemption more often than he had any practical reason to do. He told himself he was just checking on Sarah and Emma, just making sure they were managing all right. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that he'd looked forward to those visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened him. He had not felt this way about anyone since he was a young man, and even then, it had been nothing like this. Nothing as deep or as consuming. Sarah seemed to welcome his visits, though she was always careful to maintain a proper distance, never giving the gossips any real ammunition, even as Jonas knew they talked anyway. Small towns always talked, and a widow and a single man were always going to be subjects of speculation, no matter how innocent their interactions actually were. Jonas started bringing small gifts when he visited, things that could be explained away as simple generosity, but that he chose with care. A sack of apples from the ranch orchard for Emma, a length of good rope Sarah mentioned needing for her clothesline, a bag of peppermint candy that made Emma's eyes light up with joy. He helped Sarah fix the loose board on her front steps and repair the broken hinge on her garden gate, and he found himself looking for excuses to be useful, to be needed, to be part of their lives in some small way. Sarah, for her part, seemed to slowly relax around him, her initial wariness giving way to something that looked like friendship, though Jonas hoped it might be the beginning of something more. She told him about her life, about growing up in a wealthy family in Virginia and falling in love with James Dalton when he came to work on her father's estate. James had been a dreamer, she said, full of plans and hopes for the future, and when he had asked her to run away with him to Texas, she had said yes without hesitation. "I thought we were going to build an empire," she said one afternoon, as they sat on her front porch while Emma played in the yard. "James was always talking about how we would have a ranch bigger than my father's estate, how we would raise the finest cattle in Texas. He was so sure it would all work out." "What happened?" Jonas asked gently. Sarah's expression grew distant. "Reality, I suppose. Ranching is hard work, and it takes capital we did not have. James worked as a ranch hand, just like you, but the pay was never enough to save for land of our own. And then Emma came along, and suddenly we had another mouth to feed. James took the job on the cattle drive because it paid better than regular ranch work. He thought he could do a few drives, save up enough money to finally buy some land." Her voice broke slightly. "He never came back." Jonas wanted to reach out and take her hand, to offer some physical comfort, but he held back, aware of the thin line they were walking. "I am sorry," he said instead. "That must have been unbearable." Sarah wiped at her eyes impatiently. "I do not usually talk about this. I try to stay strong for Emma, to not burden her with my grief, But sometimes it is hard, pretending everything is fine, when really I am just terrified all the time. Terrified of what? She looked at him directly, and he saw the raw fear in her eyes. Of failing, of not being able to provide for Emma, of getting sick or hurt and having no one to take care of either of us, of Emma growing up and resenting me for the life I could not give her. She laughed bitterly. Of everything, really. Jonas did reach out then, unable to stop himself, and covered her hand with his where it rested on the porch railing. She did not pull away, and he felt the tremor that ran through her at his touch. "You are not failing," he said firmly. "You are surviving against odds that would break most people. Emma is healthy and happy and loved, and that is what matters. The rest will work itself out." Sarah turned her hand over so their palms were touching, and Jonas felt his heart start to race. "How can you be so sure?" she whispered. "Because I have seen you," he said simply. "I have seen your strength and your courage and your determination. Those qualities do not just disappear because times are hard. They see you through." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, something unspoken but powerful flowing between them. Then Emma called out for her mother, and the moment broke, though Jonas felt its echo in his chest for days afterward. As summer turned toward fall, Jonas found himself thinking more and more about the future. He had been at the Rocking M for nearly a year now, longer than he had stayed in any one place since his family died. Martin Calloway had hinted several times that Jonas could have a permanent position if he wanted it, maybe even become the head wrangler eventually, when old Tom Jenkins retired. It was the kind of stability Jonas had always avoided, but now he found himself considering it seriously. The reason for that consideration had green eyes and a fierce spirit and a daughter with curious questions about everything. Jonas knew he was falling in love with Sarah Dalton, and the knowledge should have terrified him, but instead, it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. He wanted to be part of her life, wanted to help her build something better than what she had, wanted to give Emma the father she deserved. But he also knew that Sarah was still grieving her husband, still wearing her loss like a cloak she could not quite shed. Jonas did not want to push her or rush her or make her feel like he expected something from her in return for his help. He wanted her to come to him freely, to choose him the way she had chosen James all those years ago, with her whole heart and no reservations. So, he was patient, more patient than he had ever been with anything else in his life. He continued to visit, continued to help where he could, continued to build a foundation of friendship and trust that might someday support something more. It was on a cool October evening when things finally shifted. Jonas had ridden into town to bring Sarah some venison from a deer he had shot, knowing that meat was expensive and she would never buy it for herself. Emma had thrown her arms around his waist when she saw him, chattering excitedly about the leaves changing color and the birds flying south for winter. Sarah had smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, and Jonas had felt that now familiar warmth in his chest. After dinner, which Sarah had insisted Jonas stay for, Emma had gone to bed, and Sarah and Jonas sat on the front porch watching the stars come out. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Sarah had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only came with people who knew each other well, and then Sarah spoke. "Jonas, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why do you keep coming here? And please do not say it is just to check on us." "I know it is more than that." Jonas felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment, he realized, the moment when he either spoke his truth or lost his chance. He thought about the ring he had carried in his pocket for months now, waiting for the right moment, and he thought about Sarah's smile and Emma's laughter, and the way his life had changed since that day in McGregor's store. "You are right," he said quietly. "It is more than that." He turned to face her, and even in the dim light from the window, he could see the anticipation and fear mingling in her expression. "I come here because being with you and Emma makes me happier than anything else in my life. I come here because I care about you both, more than I knew it was possible to care about anyone. I come here because I am in love with you, Sarah, and I have been almost from the first moment I saw you." Sarah drew in a sharp breath, and Jonas saw her hand flutter to her throat. "Jonas, I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Jonas said quickly. "I am not asking you for anything, not expecting anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to know that I am here and I will keep being here for as long as you want me to be." Sarah's eyes were shining with tears, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I am scared," she whispered. "I love James so much, and losing him nearly destroyed me. I do not know if I can survive that kind of loss again." Jonas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "I cannot promise that loss will never come," he said honestly. "None of us knows what tomorrow will bring. But I can promise that I will do everything in my power to be here for you and Emma for as long as I am able. I can promise that my feelings are true and deep and not going anywhere. And I can promise that I will never ask you to forget James or stop loving him. He gave you Emma, and he deserves to be remembered with love." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek, and she did not wipe it away. "How did you get to be so wise?" she asked with a trembling smile. "I am not wise," Jonas said. "I am just a man who knows what he wants and is willing to wait for it." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, and Jonas could see her wrestling with fear and hope and 100 other emotions. "Have been so good to us, so patient and have been so good to us, so patient and kind and steady. I think Emma loves you already." "And her mother?" Jonas asked, hardly daring to would talk. "That I was betraying James's would talk, that I was betraying James's memory. But the truth is that my heart does not seem to care about any of those things. My heart wants you." Jonas felt joy surge through him so intensely that he almost laughed. Instead, he raised Sarah's hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, feeling her shiver at the contact. "I have something I need to give you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I have been carrying it around for months, waiting for the right moment." He pulled out the ring, the gold gleaming in the starlight, and Sarah gasped when she saw it. "My ring," she breathed. "You kept it?" "I bought it so I could give it back to you," Jonas said. "I could not stand the thought of you losing something that meant so much to you. But I have been waiting for the right moment to return it, and I think that moment is now." He took her left hand, which still bore the slight indentation from years of wearing the band, and slipped the ring back onto her finger. It settled into place like it had never been gone, and Sarah stared at it with tears streaming down her face. "Jonas, I do not understand," she said. "You bought this so you could give it back to me? Why?" "Because you needed help, and I had the means to give it without taking anything away from you in the process," Jonas said simply. "Because I saw your heart breaking at the thought of losing this piece of your past, and I wanted to protect that for you. Because even then, before I knew you, I could see that you were someone worth protecting." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, and Jonas wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her close as she wept against his shoulder. He murmured soft reassurances, stroking her hair, and felt something settle into place in his chest that had been displaced for most of his life. When Sarah finally pulled back, her face was blotchy from crying, but she was smiling. "I do not deserve you," she said. "That is not true," Jonas said firmly. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer. And I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to give that to you, if you will let me." Sarah cupped his face in her hands, and Jonas could feel the cool metal of the ring against his cheek. "I will let you," she whispered, and then she kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tentative and sweet, and Jonas felt it all the way to his toes. He kissed her back gently, mindful of her vulnerability, and when they finally parted, they were both smiling. They sat on the porch for hours that night, talking about the future in a way neither of them had dared to do before. Jonas told her about Martin's offer of permanent work, about his savings and his plans to eventually buy a small piece of land where he could raise horses. Sarah told him about her dreams for Emma, about wanting to give her daughter opportunities and education, and a life better than the one she currently had. "I want to marry you," Jonas said as the night grew late. "Not right away, if you are not ready, but someday, when you feel like you can take that step. I want to make you my wife and Emma my daughter. I want to build a life with you." Sarah smiled at him, her eyes soft with love. "Someday," she agreed, "when the time is right. But Jonas, even without a piece of paper or a ceremony, I already feel like you are mine. Is that wrong?" "No," Jonas said, pulling her close. "That is exactly right." Winter came to redemption with cold winds and the occasional dusting of snow, rare enough in Texas to be a novelty when it happened. Jonas officially accepted Martin's offer of permanent work, and he started putting down roots in a way he never had before. He moved out of the bunkhouse and into a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, a place that gave him privacy and space to think about the future he was building. He and Sarah were careful about maintaining appearances, both for Emma's sake and to avoid giving the town gossips more ammunition than necessary. But Jonas was a constant presence in their lives now, stopping by most evenings for dinner, helping Emma with her letters and numbers, fixing things around the house that needed a man's strength. Emma had taken to calling him Jonas with an ease that made his heart swell, and sometimes she would slip and call him Papa before catching herself and looking worried. Jonas always reassured her that he did not mind, that she could call him whatever felt right to her, and gradually, Papa Jonas became her name for him. Sarah bloomed under the security of having Jonas in her life. The constant worry that had lined her face began to ease, and she smiled more readily, laughed more often. She started talking about expanding her baking business, about maybe saving up enough to open a small bakery someday. Jonas encouraged every dream, every plan, and started setting aside extra money from his wages to help make those dreams reality. It was in the spring, a full year after that first day in McGregor's store, that Jonas asked Sarah to marry him properly. He had saved up enough to buy a small parcel of land adjacent to the Rocking M, just 20 acres. But it was theirs, a place where they could build something together. He took Sarah and Emma out to see it on a Sunday afternoon, the land green and lush with spring growth, and he watched Sarah's face as she took in the possibilities. "This is ours?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "It will be," Jonas said, "as soon as we are married. I bought it in my name, but I want to make it ours together. We can build a house here, Sarah, a real home for all of us." Emma was running through the tall grass, laughing and chasing butterflies, and Sarah watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. "It is perfect," she said. "Jonas, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." Jonas knelt down on one knee in the grass, taking Sarah's hand in his. "Then marry me," he said. "Let me be your husband and Emma's father. Let me spend the rest of my life working to make you both happy." Sarah pulled him to his feet and kissed him soundly. "Yes," she said against his lips. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married in June, in the same white church where Sarah had gone those Sunday mornings after James died, seeking comfort in faith when everything else felt uncertain. It was a small ceremony, with just a handful of friends and neighbors present, but it felt perfect to Jonas. Sarah wore a simple cream-colored dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Emma stood between them during the ceremony, holding both their hands. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Emma cheered louder than anyone else, and Jonas laughed as he kissed his new wife for the first time as a married couple. He saw the ring on Sarah's finger, the ring he had bought and returned to her, and he thought about how far they had both come in the past year. That night, after Emma was finally asleep in her room in their small house, Jonas and Sarah lay together in their bed, talking softly about the future and marveling at how their lives had changed. Sarah traced patterns on Jonas's chest, her wedding ring catching the moonlight. "I never thought I could feel this happy again," she said quietly. "After James died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. But you showed me that hearts are more resilient than we think, that it is possible to love again without betraying the past." Jonas kissed the top of her head. "James will always be a part of our lives," he said. "He gave you Emma, and he shaped who you are. I am grateful to him for that, even though I never met him." Sarah raised herself up on one elbow to look at him, her eyes serious. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I have been thinking about for a while now. Anything. I want to take off this ring," she said, touching the band on her finger. "Not because I want to forget James, or because it does not matter anymore, but because you returned it to me when I needed it most, and it has served its purpose. It kept James's memory alive during the hardest time of my life. Want to look down and see your promise on my finger, not my past." Jonas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded. "I am sure. The love I had with James was real and important, but it belongs to the past. You are my present and my future, and I want to honor that." She slipped the gold band off her finger and placed it in Jonas's hand, then held out her left hand expectantly. Jonas took the simple silver band he had bought for their wedding ceremony and slid it onto her finger, and Sarah smiled at him with such love that he felt like the luckiest man in the world. "What should we do with this one?" Jonas asked, holding up the gold ring. Sarah thought for a moment. "Let us save it for Emma," she said. "When she is grown and ready to marry, we can give it to her and tell her the story of how her father bought it with love, and how you bought it with compassion, and how it helped bring our family together. It can be a symbol of how love can take many forms and still be true." Jonas nodded, thinking that was perfect. He placed the ring in the drawer of the bedside table, safe and secure, and then gathered Sarah into his arms. They made love that night with tenderness and passion, and afterward, as Sarah slept peacefully against his chest, Jonas stared up at the ceiling and marveled at the path his life had taken. He had been drifting for so long, rootless and alone, and now he had a wife and a daughter and land to build on. He had a purpose beyond simple survival, a reason to plan for tomorrow instead of just enduring today. And it had all started because he had seen a desperate woman trying to sell her wedding ring and had decided to help. Sometimes, Jonas thought, the smallest decisions had the biggest consequences. Sometimes, a single moment of compassion could change everything. The years that followed were good ones, filled with hard work and small triumphs, and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting. Jonas and Sarah constructed a modest but sturdy house on their 20 acres, and Jonas continued to work for Martin, while also starting to build his own herd of horses. Sarah's baking business grew steadily, and eventually, she did open a small bakery in town, partnering with another widow woman who needed work. Emma thrived, growing from a small, curious child into a bright, confident girl who excelled at her studies and had her father's way with horses and her mother's fierce determination. She called Jonas Papa without hesitation now, and while she knew about James and kept his memory alive through the stories Sarah told, Jonas was the father she knew and loved in her daily life. 2 years after their marriage, Sarah gave birth to a son, a healthy baby boy they named James Jonas Hartley, honoring both the past and the present in his name. Emma was delighted with her baby brother, and Jonas found that fatherhood suited him even better than he had imagined. He held his son and thought about his own father, lost so many years ago, and he vowed to be the kind of father who would make his own parents proud. Another daughter followed 3 years later, a tiny thing with Sarah's dark hair and Jonas's gray eyes, and they named her Rose Marie. The house that had felt so spacious when they built it suddenly seemed full to bursting with children and noise and life, and Jonas loved every chaotic moment of it. The town of Redemption grew and changed around them, transitioning from a rough frontier settlement into a more established community with schools and churches and businesses. Jonas served on the town council for a time, working to improve conditions for everyone, and Sarah became known for her generosity, always ready to help a neighbor in need, just as Jonas had once helped her. They never forgot where they had started, though. On the anniversary of the day they met every year, Jonas would take the gold ring out of its drawer, and he and Sarah would tell their children the story of how they came together. Emma never tired of hearing it, and young James and Rose listened with wide eyes, marveling at the idea that their father had been so kind and their mother so brave. As Emma grew into a young woman, beautiful and confident and ready to take on the world, suitors began to appear. Jonas found himself in the strange position of being an overprotective father, something that made Sarah laugh and shake her head. But when Emma fell in love with a young man named Thomas Miller, who worked as a teacher at the school and treated Emma with respect and genuine affection, Jonas gave his blessing. On the morning of Emma's wedding, when she was 20 years old and radiant in her mother's carefully preserved wedding dress, Jonas gave her the gold ring. She cried when he told her the full story of how he had bought it to protect her mother's memories, how it had been part of the journey that brought their family together. "I want you to have it," Jonas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your first father bought this with love, and I bought it with hope, and now I am giving it to you with pride. Wear it and remember that you come from strength and courage and determination. And remember that love is worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when times are hard." Emma hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered, "for everything. For choosing us, for loving Mama, for being the father I needed." Jonas watched Emma marry Thomas with tears in his eyes, Sarah's hand clasped tightly in his, and he thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. He had saved Sarah's ring all those years ago, not knowing that he was really saving a piece of his own future. More years passed, measured in seasons of planting and harvest, in birthdays and holidays, in the quiet moments of family dinners and the celebrations of achievements. James grew tall and strong, taking after Jonas in his love of horses and his steady, reliable nature. He eventually took over the ranch work completely, allowing Jonas to slow down as age began to catch up with him. Rose married a doctor and moved to San Antonio, but she visited often, bringing her own children to run through the same fields where she had played as a girl. Emma and Thomas settled in Redemption, teaching at the school and raising 3 children who called Jonas Grandpa and begged him for stories about the old days. Sarah's hair turned silver and lines deepened around her eyes and mouth. But to Jonas, she was as beautiful at 50 as she had been at 25. They would sit on the porch of the house they had built together, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that never got old, and Jonas would hold her hand and marvel that this was his life. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked him one evening, when they were both well into their 60s and their grandchildren were playing in the yard under Emma's watchful eye. "Regret what?" Jonas asked, genuinely puzzled. "Stopping in that store all those years ago, buying the ring, tying yourself to a widow with a child, and a mountain of troubles." Jonas turned to look at her, seeing the vulnerability beneath the question. Even after all these years, Sarah sometimes doubted that she deserved the happiness they had found. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, just as he had done that first night on her porch when he had told her he loved her. "I have never regretted a single moment," he said firmly. "You and Emma saved me just as much as I helped you. I was drifting, Sarah, going through the motions of living, without really being alive. And then I saw you in that store, so desperate and brave and beautiful, and something in me recognized that you were what I had been searching for without knowing it. You gave me purpose and family and love. You gave me everything that matters." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "We gave each other everything," she said softly. "I think James would have approved of you. I think he would have been grateful that Emma had a good father and that I found love again." "I hope so," Jonas said. "I tried to honor his memory by taking care of the family he loved." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play, and Jonas thought about the long road that had brought them here. There had been hard times mixed in with the good ones, of course. Years when the drought made money tight and they had worried about keeping the ranch running. Emma's bout with scarlet fever when she was 14 that had terrified them all. The loss of Sarah's bakery partner to consumption, and the grief that had followed. But through it all, they had faced everything together, and that had made all the difference. Jonas had learned that love was not just about the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, though those certainly had their place. Love was also about the small, daily choices to support and comfort and stand by each other. It was about holding Sarah when she cried, about her bringing him coffee when he worked late in the barn, about the way they could communicate with a glance after decades of knowing each other. As the sun set and the grandchildren were called in for dinner, Jonas helped Sarah to her feet, and they walked slowly toward the house, arms around each other. Jonas thought about the ring, now on Emma's finger, carrying forward the legacy of love and sacrifice and second chances. He thought about his children and grandchildren, the family he had helped build, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He had bought a ring 37 years ago on an impulse of compassion, and it had changed everything. It had brought him Sarah and Emma and a life richer than anything he could have imagined. And while Jonas knew that his time on earth was growing shorter, he had no regrets. He had lived a good life, a full life, surrounded by people he loved and who loved him in return. That night, lying in bed with Sarah curled against his side, as she had been for nearly 4 decades, Jonas whispered the words he had spoken countless times but never tired of saying. "I love you, Sarah Hartley." She smiled against his chest. "And I love you, Jonas. Thank you for buying my ring. Thank you for giving me a second chance at happiness." "Thank you for taking that chance," Jonas replied. "Thank you for trusting me with your heart." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Jonas dreamed of gold rings and desperate courage, and the day his life had finally begun. The years continued their relentless march, but Jonas and Sarah faced them together, their love deepening rather than diminishing with time. Jonas lived to see all his grandchildren grown, to hold his first great-grandchild in arms, grown thin with age, but still steady enough to cradle new life. He lived to celebrate 50 years of marriage to Sarah, surrounded by 3 generations of the family they had built together. When Jonas finally passed away at the age of 82, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Sarah for half a century. in the house they had built with their own hands on land they had cultivated together. Sarah held his hand as he took his last breath, and while she grieved, she also felt grateful for every moment they had shared. At his funeral, Emma told the story of the ring to her own grandchildren, passing down the tale of how a cowboy had seen her mother selling her wedding ring for medicine and had bought it only to slip it back on her finger, beginning a love story that had shaped all their lives. The ring itself was there, now worn by Emma's oldest daughter, a physical link to the past, and a reminder that kindness and courage could change the course of history. Sarah lived another 5 years after Jonas died, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, watching the ranch continue to thrive under James's management, seeing Emma's students grow and succeed. She spoke often about Jonas, keeping his memory alive with stories and love, and everyone who knew her could see that he had been the great love of her life. When Sarah finally joined Jonas in the cemetery on the hill overlooking their land, Emma placed her mother's silver wedding ring in one hand and Jonas's in the other, symbols of their eternal bond. And as the family gathered around the grave, Emma told the story one more time, the story of how love could arise from the ashes of loss, how compassion could transform lives, and how a simple act of kindness could echo through generations. The gold ring continued to pass through the family, worn by daughters and granddaughters, each one carrying forward the legacy of Sarah and Jonas. It became a talisman of sorts, a reminder that in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, there was still room for grace and love and second chances. And in Redemption, Texas, the story of the cowboy who bought back a widow's wedding ring became legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who had known Jonas and Sarah knew it was more than just a story. It was a testament to the power of love to heal and transform, to the courage it took to open your heart after loss, and to the beauty of building something lasting in a world of constant change. The ranch continued to operate for generations, the land Jonas had first purchased expanding as his descendants added to it. The house he and Sarah built was carefully maintained, becoming a place of pilgrimage for family members who wanted to connect with their roots. And in the family Bible that had been Sarah's, the story was written down in her careful handwriting, preserved for future generations who would never meet Jonas and Sarah but would benefit from the life they had built together. In the end, Jonas Hartley's legacy was not measured in land or money or achievements, though he had his share of all three. His legacy was measured in love, in the family he had chosen and nurtured, in the kindness he had shown to a desperate woman one summer day in 1878. He had bought a ring to help someone in need, never knowing that he was really buying his own future, investing in love that would compound over decades and generations. And somewhere in the eternal place beyond mortal understanding, Jonas and Sarah walked together again, young and strong, and forever bound by the love that had begun with a simple act of compassion and ended only when death could no longer keep them apart. The ring had come full circle, from love to loss to love again, and in its golden band was written the truth that would outlast them all, that love, real love, never truly ends. It simply transforms, passing from generation to generation, creating ripples that spread far beyond what any single life could encompass. The cowboy had seen her selling her wedding ring for medicine. He had bought it and slipped it back on. And in doing so, he had saved more than just a piece of jewelry. He had saved a family, created a legacy, and proved that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the quiet ones, the ones born from compassion and executed without expectation of reward. In Redemption, Texas, where the wind still blows across the plains and the sun still sets in glorious color, the story lives on. A reminder that the Wild West was not just a place of violence and hardship, but also a place where ordinary people could choose extraordinary kindness, where love could bloom in the hardest soil, and where a single moment of grace could echo through eternity. Jonas and Sarah's descendants still gather every summer on the land he bought all those years ago, under the wide Texas sky, and they tell the story to the youngest generation, keeping it alive. And somewhere in the crowd, a young woman wears a gold ring with an inscription worn smooth by time, but still readable if you know to look for it, forever. That was James's promise to Sarah. It was Jonas's gift to them both, and it became the foundation upon which an entire family built their lives, proof that forever is not just a measurement of time, but a quality of love that transcends it. The story of Jonas and Sarah Hartley was a love story, Yes, but it was more than that. It was a story about the choices we make in moments of crisis, about the courage to love again after loss, about the way compassion can transform not just individual lives, but entire legacies. It was about how the Wild West, for all its harshness, was also a place where new beginnings were possible, where the past did not have to define the future, and where a cowboy with a good heart could become a hero simply by choosing kindness. And so, the story ends where it began, with a gold ring and a desperate woman and a cowboy who chose to help. But the love they created continues, living on in the faces of their descendants, in the land they cultivated, in the stories passed down through generations. Jonas bought Sarah's ring and slipped it back on her finger, and in doing so, he bought their future, invested in love, and created something that would last far beyond their years on Earth. Love that refused to be defeated by loss. Love that refused to be defeated by loss. And the courage to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. In the end, that was what mattered most.